Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 47. In this week's episode, I'm going to be walking you through The Science of Stuck by Britt Frank, which is a book that I have often referenced as marking the start of my healing journey. It was such an incredible and validating read, and there were so many realizations that it prompted for me that have proven to be crucial to healing and to developing emotional awareness and maturity. I want to start off very early in the book with the book's dedication. Britt Frank writes, "For little b," and I can't help but think that she means for a younger version of herself. For me, this resonated with why I share my story on social media. And for anyone who doesn't know, inner child healing is acknowledging that our experiences and our relationships throughout childhood can have a lasting impact on our emotional well-being and our relationships in adulthood. And so I thought that that was a really wonderful dedication for this book, because with everything that I share, I imagine a younger version of myself coming across it and wonder what she would make of this. Would this help her? That is exactly my intention. I want to make this available to as many people as possible so that we can all start to take steps to validating our younger selves. Early on in this book, Britt Frank talks about how there are no negative emotions. There are uncomfortable and scary emotions, but even the most unpleasant emotions serve an important function. I had seen phrases like this on social media from this book that were so powerful, that deeply resonated with me, that contradicted a lot of what I was conditioned to believe growing up. One of those things being that there were positive and negative emotions. And negative emotions were the uncomfortable ones, the bigger ones, like fear, sadness, anger, nerves, anxiety. And I, like I'm sure a lot of you, were conditioned to believe that those emotions were negative. They didn't serve any real purpose. And so anytime we felt them, we should sort of tuck them away or pretend like they're not there, or try to not feel those things without ever acknowledging why we are indeed feeling them. I think there's also a bit of shame that can make its way to the surface when you are experiencing those emotions throughout childhood, because it's inevitable. I think there is a wide spectrum of emotions, and we experience all of them throughout our lives. And so throughout childhood, before we might be aware of this, if we find ourselves sitting with anger or sadness, we might start to feel shame for feeling these negative emotions and not being able to just get over them without understanding where they come from or doing anything to process them. And one of the things that I have come to realize throughout my healing journey is that there aren't positive or negative emotions. Emotions are just emotions, and some of them make us feel good, and some of them make us feel not so good. But that doesn't discount the validity of them. And it's equally as important to learn how to acknowledge and process these uncomfortable emotions as it is the emotions that make us feel comfortable. I think you can argue that it's even more important to learn how to acknowledge these things, because sitting with happiness or joy or excitement can sometimes feel much easier than sitting with grief or sadness or resentment. I think sometimes these more uncomfortable or unpleasant emotions can be more difficult to understand. They might be coming from a place that's a bit more obscure. Throughout my healing journey, I have come to understand that tracing these things back and understanding why we feel the way that we feel is really helpful in taking away the power of these unpleasant and uncomfortable emotions. And that the only way that you're going to learn how to acknowledge and process them is by sitting with them. And to take that one step further, if you consistently suppress these emotions, if you pretend like they're not there, if you feel shame for even thinking that you're feeling this, and you try to tuck it away and say that you're not truly feeling like this, that it's just going to go away, I'm here to tell you that it will not go away. It will resurface down the line in a much more complicated way, and it might come out at a time that's completely inconvenient, where it doesn't truly make sense. But maybe all of these bottled up emotions are finally making their way to the surface and they explode. And so it is much better, much more helpful for you to sit with and process your emotions as you feel them. That is the healthy thing to do. And yet so many of us are not taught that throughout childhood. We are in fact conditioned to believe the opposite, that the better we get at suppressing our uncomfortable and our unpleasant emotions, the better we are, the stronger we are. And that's not true. Britt Frank also goes on to list some of the signs of unresolved trauma. And this was one of the sections of the book that was very clear, very succinct. And in reading it, I started to realize that I myself was sitting with a lot of unresolved trauma. And so I want to relay some of these points to you, so maybe they can be as helpful to you as they were to me. Indecisiveness can be a sign of unresolved trauma. Now, it's normal for us to experience indecisiveness every now and then. But if you are consistently struggling to make decisions, this can be a sign of unresolved trauma. And immediately, this makes me think about the self-doubt that so many of us develop when we're raised by emotionally immature parents. And there are a number of different reasons that we might come to doubt ourselves. Everything from gaslighting, our parent intentionally manipulating us so that we come to doubt our perception of reality, to the unrealistically high standards and expectations that sometimes our parents expect us to live up to or to exceed. And anytime we fall short of those things, we feel like we are less than. Because so often, emotionally immature parents prioritize performance over personality. So often, I think when you're raised by an emotionally immature parent, you are conditioned to believe that you are an extension of them. And I think it's really common for your parents' well-being to be at the center of your decisions. I know for a long time, I based my decisions solely on what I thought my parents would want me to do. And this can be so confusing, especially throughout childhood, this time when we're supposed to be engaging in trial and error and making mistakes and experimenting with our sense of self. Who are we? What are the things that we like, that we don't like? Should I try this food? Am I friends with this person? Do I like the way that they treat me? So many questions arise during these really formative developmental years. And part of becoming an adult, I think, is taking the steps to answer these questions for ourselves. But in these spaces, we are not given that opportunity. And so we recenter, sort of reshift the focus of our own lives and our own decisions onto what we think will make our parents happy. What will appease our parents? And so that, I think, can contribute to a lot of self-doubt, because maybe internally, personally, we're feeling or thinking one thing that feels true to who we are, but we know that if we express that, we might be made to feel like we are somehow less than. We might be punished for doing the wrong thing. And so there's this consistent sort of internal battle that's taking place between what's right for you and what's right for your parent. And I think what can be so challenging about this decision throughout childhood is that so much of what we need is dependent on our parents' support and attention. We are not yet able to support ourselves. And so there's so much more weight, or there can be so much more weight attached to how our parents feel about us rather than how we feel about ourselves. Over-apologizing is another one of the characteristics that Britt Frank lists as a sign of unresolved trauma. And this immediately rang a bell for me as someone who consistently finds herself apologizing for things that I didn't even do. Someone could bump into me and I apologize on their behalf. I have grown so accustomed to fearing controversy and conflict that I am almost instinctually willing to take responsibility for mistakes that I didn't even make, if that means not upsetting the other person that's involved. And this, I think, is so reminiscent of the experience that so many of us have shared throughout childhood, where our parents' reactions were that much more volatile and explosive. And so it was so much easier for us to just take the blame than it was for us to try to hold them accountable and to maybe get an apology. And it can be really challenging when that mentality follows us into adulthood, because we don't stand up for ourselves. We allow other people to walk all over us, and at what cost? I've seen, as I'm sure a lot of you have, this post on social media that circulates that talks about keeping the peace and coming to a point where you start to realize, whose peace am I keeping? I think that is so indicative of so many of our relationships with our emotionally immature parents. We are conditioned to believe that by suppressing our emotions and remaining quiet, accepting unhealthy behavior, we are doing the right thing because we are keeping the peace. Not ours, but our parents. We are suppressing our emotions. We are constantly existing in a state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. We are not learning healthy conflict resolution. Instead, we are being taught that the right thing to do is to give in to the person around you who is more powerful, who is more intimidating, who has more pull than you do. And that undoubtedly leads to so many different self-neglecting behaviors that adult children of emotionally immature parents experience. ADD, ADHD, and OCD can all also be signs of unresolved trauma. Existing in a constant state of stress for an extended period of time dysregulates our nervous system and can lead to the development of these different mental health conditions, or it can intensify the symptoms of pre-existing conditions. People pleasing. This is something that I know so many of us have grown accustomed to. It has sort of become a part of our lives. Difficulty saying no. This can also be a sign of unresolved trauma. And this goes back to the idea of self-neglect that we were talking about earlier. I think it is so common when we are raised by emotionally immature parents to feel like the more mature person in that relationship. Like our parents are less stable, less mature, less aware, and so we take on the responsibility of regulating their emotions for them. We grow accustomed to these emotional outbursts, and one of the most consistent things in a relationship with an emotionally immature parent is the inconsistency, the unpredictability. And so we develop these people-pleasing tendencies as a way to consistently appease our parent and to make them happy, to make sure that they're okay. Because you don't have to worry about me. I'm fine. I can handle it. I need to make sure that you are okay. Because when you're okay, then everyone is okay. And so we're conditioned to believe that neglecting ourselves is one of the best things that we can do for our parent and in turn for our family as a whole. Another sign of unresolved trauma that Britt Frank lists is mind racing. And in revisiting these different topics, I immediately drew a connection between this and hypervigilance. And hypervigilance is something that we've talked a lot about. For anyone who is new or maybe hearing the term hypervigilance for the first time, it is this intense preoccupation with what's going on around you, the emotions of the people that you're around. You are hyper aware of what's going on and how other people are feeling. And what happens for so many of us who are raised by emotionally immature parents is that we develop this ability to be hypervigilant, to sort of understand how they're feeling without them ever having to directly say that to you. And that is one of those behaviors that once you grow accustomed to that in childhood and you're rewarded for it, it can feel almost impossible to even recognize that you're doing that in adulthood. And that is one of the reasons that it is so important to talk about this. But hypervigilance, I think, sometimes can lead to mind racing. When you find yourself with a friend or a partner or in a social setting and you're overanalyzing everything that's happening, you're wondering if everyone's having a good time. Did something you say sit wrong with someone because now all of a sudden they've changed their tone just slightly? It's sort of this ongoing analysis. And the issue with hypervigilance, I think, is that it isn't based on any sort of direct communication. I think it can even be beneficial to be able to read the room and to have a general understanding of how people are feeling. But I think when there's no direct communication involved and these thoughts sort of consume you, they get in the way of you actually showing up in these different experiences or relationships, that I think is when it can start to be damaging. One of the last signs of unresolved trauma that I want to talk to you about is difficulty relaxing. This is something that resonated with me, and I'm sure it resonates with a lot of you. Productionism is not a new concept. I think being raised by an emotionally immature parent, there is often more priority and more value put on the things that you do for your parent rather than just who you are. And I think you can also sometimes be made to feel bad by your parent for doing things that are purely fun, like maybe spending time with a friend or indulging in a hobby, whether that's drawing or painting or playing an instrument. They may not feel as serious as some of the very real adult issues that you might be tasked with addressing or solving within your family dynamic. And so productivity seems to be more important than play, even throughout childhood. But play is so crucial to development, and yet so many of us are robbed of that opportunity. And in adulthood, I think that translates to always feeling like you could or should be doing more, which, as I'm sure a lot of us know, eventually leads to burnout. It's not sustainable to be doing things all the time, but I know I have felt so guilty in the past anytime I would allow myself to have downtime that I wouldn't end up enjoying it because I would be too preoccupied with the idea that I'm sitting down, not doing anything productive, not doing anything that's getting me closer to my goals, so I'm really just wasting time. And these thoughts wouldn't allow me to relax, and so my downtime was almost counterproductive. But something that I have come to realize as a perfectionist, as someone who does put a lot of value on productivity, or at least has in the past, is that rest is necessary, and rest in and of itself is productive, because without rest, you're going to burn yourself out. And so now I don't feel as guilty when I allow myself downtime because I know that it is a necessary step. And while it may not be getting me any closer to my goals on the surface, it's supplying me with that energy and that perspective that I think sometimes you can only get by taking a step back that's going to get me to my goals, maybe even sooner. And what I think is even more important than that is that when I do reach my goals, I will be reaching them as a sustainable version of myself, as someone who hasn't been sprinting towards the finish line, and then once I get there, I collapse. I'll run across the finish line and still feel good enough to keep going. And I think that is a really important goal that I have sort of set for myself, something that's allowed me to enjoy my downtime and see the value in it. But I think that that can be something really difficult to convince ourselves of, especially amidst the hustle culture that has become so prevalent in our society. I want to pose this question to you also, because this is something that I have done myself so many times. It used to be subconsciously, but I've grown increasingly aware of it. Do you ever find yourself sitting alone in a room, relaxing, not doing anything? Maybe you're watching TV, you're mindlessly scrolling on Instagram, or you're petting your dogs. You're doing something that is not objectively productive. And then someone, a friend or a partner or a family member, walks into the room, and then all of a sudden, you make yourself look like you're doing something productive. You turn the TV off. You open a book if it's nearby. You start writing. You start doing something that the other person might perceive to be of value, because you don't want them to think that by you just resting and allowing yourself to relax, like you're somehow being lazy. I invite you to think about that and to ask yourself if that's something that you do or that you have done, and to maybe start to unpack why that might be, so that in the future you can allow yourself some guilt-free downtime, because it's pretty great. Britt Frank also goes on to talk about how trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. Trauma is our brain's inability to process and metabolize information. She also goes on to say that the past remains present until it is processed. And it was little nuggets of information like this for me, these few sentences that unlocked so much of why I was feeling the way that I was feeling at the start of my healing journey. Emotionally immature parents do not create a safe environment for their children to learn, to make mistakes, and to develop. There's little to no empathy, little to no forgiveness, little to no compassion. And so how can we ever express how we're feeling about the way our parent made us feel, about how hurtful the things that they might have said or done to us actually are, if they have no empathy, if they are not willing to hear us or to validate our emotions and make amends, if we are consistently met with denial and gaslighting, we come to realize even throughout childhood that we are not in a space safe enough to express our true emotions. And if we ever do, that can sometimes intensify the problem. And so we learn very quickly that the best thing that we can do for our own survival is to keep these things inside. And I used to think that these things would just go away. You didn't have to sit with and process your emotions. You can just sort of sweep things under the rug and move on because they're gone. They're under the rug. But the truth is, all of these things stay with us until we make the decision to process them. Oftentimes, it's not until we find ourselves in an environment safe enough, whether we've grown up and we've moved out, or maybe we've moved in with a friend, or we've started therapy and we're speaking with a therapist. I think it's not until we find ourselves in an environment safe enough that we can even begin the process of understanding that there are emotions there, that there are things that we need to acknowledge and process and unpack because they haven't gone away. Something else that I thought was so valuable that Britt Frank talks about in this book is the idea that we all come from dysfunctional families. And I think that is so true. I think every family, every relationship dynamic has their pros and cons. I think there are things that people do that are healthy, and I think there are things that people do that are unhealthy. People make mistakes, and it's unrealistic for us to think that any one person or family gets it right 100% of the time. But the difference, she points out, is that healthy parents don't avoid mistakes. They identify and do their best to correct mistakes. That is sort of the crucial difference between an emotionally immature and an emotionally mature parent, is accountability and an effort to make amends. I think that is why so many of us have ultimately made the decision to go no or low contact with our parent or parents, because when you are voicing concerns and you're telling someone about the way that you feel about a mistake that they made or about something that they did that was hurtful to you, and you are met with the denial of any responsibility or involvement. Maybe you're met with gaslighting, someone trying to tell you that that never happened or you're remembering it wrong. Or maybe you're met with complete disinterest in trying to take steps in any sort of a positive direction. I think so often emotionally immature parents can take accountability or a child seeking accountability as a personal attack, and they immediately can become defensive. That doesn't leave very much space for healthy conflict resolution. And unfortunately, that can sometimes get in the way of the relationship entirely. There is a chapter in this book called The Emotionally Unskilled Family. And in that chapter, Britt Frank outlines 10 signs of an emotionally unskilled family. And I don't think I will ever forget reading this chapter because I was starting to connect some of the dots in terms of realizing my own childhood trauma and understanding a bit more about my parents and why our relationship stood where it stood. But it wasn't until I got to this chapter, more specifically this list, that I started to realize just how much behavior I had grown accustomed to that was in fact not normal. that was in fact unhealthy. And so I want to share this with you. The first sign or behavior that she mentions is gaslighting. Gaslighting, again, isn't a new concept. We have talked about this so much, but again, for anyone who might be tuning in for the first time, gaslighting is when someone causes you to doubt your perception of reality. You can sometimes unintentionally gaslight someone, but when you're dealing with an emotionally immature or a narcissistic parent, the gaslighting is an intentional form of emotional abuse. They are trying to get you to doubt yourself and the way that you experience the world so that you are entirely reliant on them and their recollection of events. It allows them to always be in a power position and to always elude responsibility and blame. It might sound like, you're remembering that wrong. You're completely overreacting. I never said that. There are so many different forms of gaslighting, and it is undoubtedly one of the signs of an emotionally unskilled family. Next up, we've got parentification, which is when a child becomes responsible for the tasks of parenting or for regulating or managing their parents' emotions. It is so common in these kind of parent-child relationships to feel, despite your age difference and despite your position within your family, like the more emotionally mature and stable person in this relationship. Prioritizing our parents' emotions over our own, mainly due to their volatile reactions, their unpredictability, can sometimes lead us to being parentified, where we feel like we are taking on the burdens of parenting ourselves and also of parenting our parents. But I think what can be so challenging about this throughout childhood is that it feels good to make your parent happy. I think so many of us want our parents' approval, and we want our parents to feel loved and cared for. And when you're dealing with a narcissistic parent specifically, I think they can manipulate that innocence and that kindness. They can sort of look to their child as their best friend. They might even use that sort of language and make their child feel like they are the only person in the world who truly sees them and who is truly there for them. And as a result, this child might take on some very adult responsibilities that are far beyond their current capabilities. And the opposite of that, which is another sign of an emotionally unskilled family, is infantilization. Infantilization is when parents try to keep their child dependent because it makes them feel needed. And so this might look like your parent making some very basic decisions for you as you get older. Maybe they're always cooking your meals, they're always doing your laundry, and anytime you show any sort of interest in taking on age-appropriate responsibilities, maybe like getting a summer job, they discourage you. They reassure you that these things aren't necessary, that they'll just do them for you. And while on the surface, especially throughout childhood and even our early teens, these things may not raise any red flags. They might even seem favorable because we don't have to do as much work as our peers. In truth, it's really damaging because it's not allowing us the space to develop the independence that's necessary for adulthood. But I think independence is a really scary concept for emotionally immature parents because they might start to feel like they are no longer needed by their child. And so they might infantilize them to try to combat that. Next up, we've got triangulation. Triangulation is basically when two people talk about a third person without that third person being present. I'm sure all of us have had conversations, whether it's with friends or family members, about another person when that other person is not in the room. The difference with triangulation is that there is an incentive, there is a manipulative motive behind those conversations. And one of the examples that I like to use in describing triangulation is if you've got an emotionally or physically abusive parent and an enabling parent and a child. And the enabling parent, who in the past has been very passive and accepting of the abusive parent's behavior, is finally starting to realize just how unhealthy this is. And so the parent starts to pull away. And they start to lean into their individuality and their power within that relationship and within that family dynamic. and they start to say that certain things aren't okay. The abusive parent starts to feel like this parent might leave. In a situation like this, the abusive parent might pull the child to the side and might start offering up indulgences that the other parent doesn't allow, like dessert before dinner. The abusive parent might consistently be in the child's ear saying that the enabling parent is always responsible for all of the controversy that's happening. They are the main reason for all of this stress. They might start feeding lies to the child about the other parent who is now trying to stand up to the abuser to try to earn the child's favor. In doing so, they are attempting to turn the child against the parent who is trying to hold the abuser accountable for their behavior. Narcissistic parents specifically can sometimes employ this sort of manipulative triangulation to try to get a partner or a spouse to fall back in line, to go back to the way that things were, where they are in power. They are in control of all of the decisions and of the family dynamic. And then we've got perfectionism. Perfectionism, I think, stems from performance. This performance that so many of us feel like we have to put on throughout childhood to appease our parents, to be a version of ourselves that is more suitable to them than it is authentic to ourselves. I think there is also a fear of controversy and of making mistakes. We never want to be the center of any sort of negative attention because there's already enough of that present. And so we will do everything in our power to make sure that everything we do is just right. We touched on this a bit earlier, but productionism is another sign of an emotionally unskilled family, sort of reinforcing the value of play and how there isn't always space for that in these unhealthy environments that so many of us grow up in. We feel like we always have to be doing something that is quote unquote productive, that maybe our parents deem productive. Sign number 7 is blurred lines, which references boundaries, which in this book is centered around physical boundaries and maybe a parent telling you that you have to give them a hug, even if you're feeling uncomfortable. But I would like to extend this to emotional boundaries as well. I think it is so common for those of us who were raised in these unhealthy environments to really have no true sense of autonomy or individuality throughout childhood. I know I grew up feeling like I was an extension of my parents, and I believed that that was the way that all children felt. And it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I started to recognize that I am an individual. I am my own person. And I don't always have to do what my parents think is right or what my parents want me to do. There does come a time when what I want and what I feel comes into play, and me following that doesn't make me any less of a person, and it doesn't make me a bad person. I didn't know that I could say to my parents, what you're saying or doing right now is hurtful to me, and I would like you to not do that again in the future. I never felt like I was in a position of power to draw that sort of line in the sand because I was the child and they were the adult. And so it always felt like what I felt was secondary to their beliefs because they knew more. They've been around for longer. They know what's best. And so I was consistently submitting to what they wanted, to their will, banking on the fact that they did indeed have my best interest in mind. But unfortunately, as so many of us come to realize, emotionally immature parents are so self-focused that the needs of their child are secondary. Next up, Britt Frank talks about different controlling behaviors, the aspect of control in general, using intimidation, guilt, or emotional outbursts to maintain power over relationships within a family, over finances, chores. She talks about yelling as a form of verbal abuse. And it wasn't until I was 21 years old and I had gotten some perspective that I came to realize that when talking about sensitive topics, it was not the norm for people, parents and families, to yell at each other. Up until that point, I didn't ever truly think that there were family dynamics that existed where you could talk about stressful topics or challenging topics at a normal volume. all the while maintaining respect for one another and approaching the conversation with empathy and understanding, and the goal of reaching some sort of common ground. Everything felt combative. Everything felt like a war against each other, like we had to pick a side and stick to it and fight for it, and someone was going to win and someone was going to lose. I don't think the art of compromise is often taught by emotionally immature parents. And if you're not exposed to that throughout childhood, it can be hard to imagine that there are places and relationships where that exists. Sign number 9 is the closed family system, which basically describes this mentality where outside people are not trusted. Outside influences are not welcome. And this closed family system is resistant to change of any kind, even healthy change. I was often told throughout childhood that family problems stay within the family. And if there was ever even a hint of me talking about what was going on within my family with someone outside of our immediate family, I knew that I was going to get in trouble for that. And I understand to a certain degree in relationships, keeping certain things private, respecting the privacy of another person, or maybe working through something with someone directly rather than going out and gossiping. But we're not talking about gossiping here. I think emotionally immature parents don't ever want their child to be talking about what's going on behind the scenes, because it can often be the antithesis of what people outside of their immediate family see. And I think sometimes speaking openly about these things can either offer their child perspective, or it can raise some red flags for whoever it is that they're talking to. And then the parent might get called out, and this image that they've worked so hard to maintain might come crumbling down. I think a closed family system is a way to prevent children from gaining perspective. It is a way to prevent children from seeing that there are other healthier relationship dynamics and family systems. And because of that, we come to accept all kinds of unhealthy behavior, and the toxicity is allowed to continue. The manipulation is allowed to continue, and ultimately, our parent remains in control. And lastly, we've got rigid roles, which is basically the idea that in an emotionally unskilled family, specific roles can be assigned to specific family members, and any attempts to change those roles are met with resistance. And in, again, revisiting these different points and this book as a whole, now a year after I've read it for the first time, it brought to the surface this idea of roles within a narcissistic family. You've often got a narcissistic parent, an enabling parent, a golden child, and a scapegoat. And while these roles can shift and change within this family dynamic, I think there is something to be said about assigning a role to a child and expecting them to adhere to that role for their entire lives. Change is something that I think emotionally immature parents have a really difficult time dealing with. And assigning roles, I think, provides a certain level of predictability within a family system like this. It allows a parent to know what to expect from their child. And anytime their child might venture outside of this role that has been assigned to them, that sort of opens things up for them to develop differently, for their personality to change, for maybe them to take on a new friend that might challenge the family system. There are so many different possibilities and opportunities, in truth, when we're talking about change, but emotionally immature parents don't often welcome that. And so they might shame their child if they entertain the idea of venturing outside of this role. They might make them feel like they're doing the wrong thing, that because they're already this way, that they can't ever possibly be that way. And so it can be really easy for us throughout childhood, again, when you consider all of these other factors that we've talked about, from self-neglect and people-pleasing to blurred lines and a lack of boundaries. It can be really difficult for us to actually stand up and move outside of these roles, to kind of break past them and to uncover not just one, but all of the different aspects of our personalities. Now, I know that this has been a lot of information for you to take in. So I want to invite you to be patient with yourself as you process all of these different things. I also want to take a minute before I wrap up this week's episode to thank Britt Frank for writing this book and for making these resources available to people like me. Because I don't think there will ever be a time in my life when I don't think about this book as the dawn of my healing journey. It prompted so many realizations in my life, and it was so validating. It validated so much of my experience throughout childhood, and that was the first time that I had ever experienced that kind of validation about that subject. And it was so moving for me. It's such a big part of why I am where I am today. So thank you, Britt Frank. I will leave the link to this book in the description of this week's episode. So if you are interested in reading further, you can go ahead and snag it. And with that, I think I'm going to be wrapping up this week's episode of It's Not Normal. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. I'll be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast.